Welcome to the Miller Report Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Does a conversation about race belong in mathematics? We take a look at Lee Fang's latest investigation titled Billionaires Backing Woke Math Doesn't Add Up Amid DEI Rollback. Across much of the country, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are under fire. But in America's classrooms, some of the nation's wealthiest philanthropies are pushing forward, and they're using math education as the vehicle. The Heising-Simmons Foundation, led by Liz Simmons, is spending millions of dollars to promote what it calls social justice math. The idea, to move away from traditional methods of teaching that emphasize computation, right answers, showing your work. Critics of those traditional methods are arguing that they're tied to what they called white supremacist culture. These reforms are intended to better motivate disadvantaged students, especially Black and Latino youth, by reducing emphasis on these traditional methods. The movement promotes numberless word problems stripped of numerical computation to counter European ways of knowing and doing, potentially disadvantaging non-native English speakers who excel at calculation. The Heising-Simmons Foundation isn't the only organization pushing for this type of change. In online webinars and conversations surrounding, quote, anti-racist math, there is a focus on identity issues as opposed to the mechanics of the mathematics itself. Now, there is no credible evidence that these alternative math approaches improve student performance, but that hasn't stopped billionaire philanthropies from doubling down on this social justice framework. We're joined now by the lead investigator on this story, Lee Fang. Lee, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Maggie, thank you so much for having me.
I found your article fascinating and really well written, and yet I still left with some big picture questions, none of which having to do with your journalism work, but I attribute it to the lack of evidence and examples by those implementing these practices. Can you tell me, how can math be racist and why does it need to be anti-racist? I feel like they weren't even explaining the full scope of what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, look, the far left has had these kind of year zero ideas around remaking all of education through an ideological or partisan lens for a very long time. If you look in the early Soviet Russia, they attempted to change all the kind of math and other types of curriculum to add coursework around socialism and kind of ideological exercises to indoctrinate students around their political beliefs. Similar practices were seen in China during the Cultural Revolution with the Chinese Communist Party. And we've seen these kind of ideas in the parallels in the United States kind of percolate on the fringes. Folks who are very ideologically left-wing, who are very concerned around social justice and racial justice. And, with the advent of critical race theory in the late 80s, this has existed in academia for some time now. And it's really the core of it. It's this belief that education should be an ideological training ground, that the kind of core critical thinking skills and basic arithmetic come secondary to a political education. And so that's really kind of the root of some of these concepts that I talk about in my piece. I don't go over the whole history here, but the history is fascinating in that this is something that has existed in the fringes for some time now. What's new is that, we've had the last 10 years of kind of an ideological uprising on the left and a number of very powerful foundations and billionaires who've embraced these ideas, and they have the resources to put them into practice.
Did you also find, similar to what I was finding, was that they weren't giving enough explanation, I felt like, for me to adequately understand the importance of what they were trying to implement. Was that something that you also took away, or no?
Well, if you talk to the advocates of some of these, for lack of a better term, woke math ideas, there is a concern around the racial achievement gap, which is something that people on the left and the right and the center have talked about for a very long time. Public schools are really failing a big chunk of American students. There are many people who are falling behind, who are not doing well on standardized tests on reading and math. And rather than kind of getting back to the basics and teaching core, memorization of the multiplication table or, basic number skills, there's this idea that, no, we've got to actually lower standards to get rid of this achievement gap. So, 10 years ago in the city I live in San Francisco, there was a successful effort to remove middle school algebra because of a concern that Black and Hispanic students were not scoring highly enough in middle school algebra. And rather than reducing the achievement gap, it basically made no improvement at all when students came into high school because, big surprise here, they're less prepared for high school calculus or pre-cal. So, the motivation came from this, I think, very broad concern about the racial achievement gap. It's just the medicine for the disease actually made the problem much worse. That made the disease worse.
I mean, you just really spoke to it because I understand the desire to fix the issues within the classroom. We're all aware that there are plenty that exist, but I wonder if the money would be better put used for greater fundamental issues in education, that it has the evidence showing that it's an issue as opposed to social justifying math. I feel like they're wanting to accomplish the right goal, but I'm just not sure if they're going through it with the right tools.
That's exactly right. And, for any kind of complex policy, issue, problem that we confront as a society, we really need to get back to the basics and look at what are evidence-based solutions. There are a lot of great minds thinking about these problems, and this is a big country with a lot of different school districts. We do see experimentation in many districts, like in Dallas, Texas, and parts of actually in Mississippi and Louisiana, where they are raising standards, where they are kind of doing automatic placement of young students into advanced algebra, into middle school algebra. And in places like Dallas, Texas, that has proven to reduce the racial achievement gap. More Black and Latino students are placing into advanced algebra into high school when they're placed early on. And when you raise expectations, students actually perform better. So, there's a lot of different models to look at, but unfortunately, some of these billionaire foundations, these very dogmatic progressive groups, I don't think they're looking at the evidence. They're looking through an ideological prism. A lot of these donors are the same groups that worked to abolish police in 2020, that gave out a lot of money to protesters, to activist groups that seemed to make the public safety problem much worse. But they were, again, doing so through an ideological prism, thinking that, this is something that conforms to their values, but did not really reflect the evidence or the kind of most rational policy response.
I mean, while I was reading your piece, I was thinking to myself, I was happy to be in the basic math class in high school because, math was never my thing. I was an English, social studies gal. So I kind of didn't understand why allowing people who excel in that field to then learn it at a higher level was seen as a bad thing. I never thought, oh, I'm in the basic math class because I'm Hispanic. I never thought that. I was just like, math is not my discipline of choice. So is math itself as a discipline not considered objective? I feel like most people think that that's one of the more objective disciplines. If it's English and students are receiving bad grades, then I feel like it's easier to comprehend, like, oh, English is very subjective and we're writing pieces about our own experiences, which then, have a play into the grades we might be receiving. But I feel like math is considered more objective.
Yeah, I think this gets at one of the great ironies of this entire debate. For these liberal foundations, many of them are motivated, they claim, out of concern for vulnerable communities, immigrant communities, some of these folks coming from a non-English speaking household, and for generations of immigrants, math was the great equalizer, because if you didn't have great English skills, you could excel at just numbers, looking at an equation that is universal, that is truly objective. And for these liberal foundations that claim to have a concern around these types of communities, they're claiming that objective math is a European idea or a white supremacist idea, and they've pushed kind of a language-centric approach to math, so that they're calling for a numberless approach to math where it's very prose heavy, it's very kind of English kind of story and narrative based math. And really the irony here is that who is it going to harm the most? It's going to be those immigrant kids that really need objective, kind of clear math, traditional math programs to succeed. Loading it up with lots of narrative and prose is only going to harm the communities they claim to represent.
Yeah, it was a difficult concept for me to get in that regard. In one of the examples you cited in your article, it was students were asked to count the people who weren't white in a picture book, and then they then ranked the books accordingly. And I wondered, obviously, they're trying to elevate certain groups with this quote unquote woke math, but are they not doing so in a way that's introducing divisive practices?
Look, I'm not an education expert or child psychology expert, but just as a normal person watching these exercises, I find it extremely damaging. You know, uh, such uh, these are such crude concepts of race and identity that really, I think, harm the children that are going through these types of exercises. You know, this is one exercise where kids were asked to go through all their picture books and then count the number of races of each character and then tally up the score and then vote for the books that had the least white characters. And this is just such a damaging way to teach identity formation. It really just teaches harmful stereotypes, and really kind of robs the innocence of youth. Kids should be learning the joy of reading and understanding the storylines, the narratives, not taking this kind of very crude way of stigmatizing any single racial group, whether it's whites or any other group, and rejecting them as simply because they were harmful or viewed as an oppressor, or any of these kind of derogatory terms that are taught by these teachers. I find it incredibly harmful. Again, here's another irony is that this is cast as a kind of altruistic racial justice narrative, justice exercise for teachers to take part in. And I just don't see the justice in this. I see students being actually raised to be perhaps even more racist, more kind of suspicious of people with a certain skin color.
Well, so obviously you looked at this, and the title of your piece is discussing it within a bit of the DEI framework that is just constantly in the news right now. Everyone's been talking about where DEI is going, where it's been, and how it's changing. So, how do you see this continuing forward within the current climate that we're seeing surrounding DEI?
There's been a big public backlash, public opinion. The courts have ruled against some similar policies in higher education. Now the Trump administration is taking a cudgel to these policies by issuing executive orders, really kind of revamping federal contracting and federal grants to disincentivize these kind of racial prioritization or racial discriminatory practices. Where it hasn't really reached is K through 12, and that's partially because so little federal funding goes to K-12. It's really kind of outside the reach of the federal government. It's mostly funded by states and local counties and property taxes, that type of thing. So it's the kind of one last major American institution that has not seen much of an oversight, whether through the courts or otherwise. And it's where a lot of these big foundations are focusing their efforts. But again, when the voters are given an opportunity to vote on any of these policies, whether by proxy or directly, there's a huge rejection. In San Francisco last year, there's a vote to return middle school algebra after almost a decade of removing it because of racial equity reasons. This is San Francisco, one of the most liberal cities in America. Over 80% of voters demanded that algebra be placed back into middle school. We also recalled several of the education board members because of this decision. It's been a proxy issue in elections in Virginia, in New York, and Pennsylvania. People really from across the aisle, from across the ideological divide, regardless of race or demographics, have rejected these policies. But they continue to proliferate. Again, I think because of what I'm reporting in this piece, because if you take any fringe idea and you have a powerful set of foundations, whether it's the Gates Foundation or the Simons Foundation, these are very powerful folks with a lot of resources. You can really elevate them and push them, even if voters reject them, the courts reject them, and parents reject them.
So, Lee, what were your key takeaways, and what do you want to leave people with?
Well, I don't think anyone has a perfect solution to the problems that we all recognize. Um, Public schools are failing our students. We need to have them fixed. We need higher achievement. We need kids to learn to read and do basic math. And I'm hoping that we take an evidence-based approach. People learn in different ways. I'm very open to that, and I don't think that anyone has a single solution. But some of these extreme ideas, they would not be implemented if not for the role of these billionaires. And I hope folks just pay a little bit more attention with the ideas that are being introduced into curriculum, that are being introduced in some of these school boards at the behest of some of these very radical groups.
And there is respect that there are these powerful and rich people that are trying to make a difference. It just might be a little bit of an ill-informed approach. Well, Lee, thank you so much for your time.
Maggie, thanks for having me.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.